We're running out of gas, and the shortage is setting some power companies up to lose. The energy industry desperately needs a solution, but it could cost investors.
In the Indigenous gas sector, we operate essentially 6 fields, and that accounts for 95% of supply. Each of those fields is in decline. But what happens from here is deeply uncertain because the investment that's required to stabilise, let alone to increase gas supply, is anything but firm or confirmed.
We have a gas shortage on our hands. Supply nationally is down and demand is up. The need for gas from homes and industrial users is expected to continue outstripping our production for the next 3 years, according to the government ministry MBIE. The largest listed power company, Genesis, relies on gas to efficiently power its Huntly station. Because of that, it has a 46% stake in the Kupe oil and gas field in the Taranaki. But attempts to extract more gas from it earlier this year failed, impacting its finances materially and leaving it with no choice but to import more coal. It has a stockpile at Huntly of 350,000 tonnes of coal to back up the electricity system, at a time where hydro lakes are low and wind farms haven't kept up. Unlike oil, we don't import any gas into New Zealand. We rely solely on extracting it from our fields. But production at all of the major fields is declining, despite companies investing about $1 billion into them over the past 3 years. Add to that, our gas reserves have declined to a record low. As a result, gas wholesale prices have shot up to a new record. While some of our power companies do sell retail gas, ultimately none of this is ideal for the energy industry, especially those exposed to spot prices. John Kidd is the head of research at independent firm Enerlytica. He's sounding the alarm. He says the energy industry is in deep distress, but a solution could still be found. John, thank you so much for coming in. Good to see you.
Good morning.
It looks pretty ugly on paper, the supply and demand picture. How would you describe it? How bad actually is it?
That's probably a fair assessment, I think. If the market's always right, then the markets are telling us that it hasn't been this bad, I think probably ever. So we've got gas pricing, which is towards $40 a gigajoule. We've got electricity prices, which are tapping through $500 a megawatt hour next month. In both cases, I've not seen it that bad. These are unprecedented type prices. So if the market's right, then we're in a state of some distress.
How are we here? Like seriously, I feel like this happens every single year. We talk about resilience of the electricity system and how we need to do better, which is why these companies are spending billions of dollars on renewable energy. Yet in 2024, it's the worst it's ever been.
Yeah, so I mean, it's never one single factor. There's a lot of build going on, but there is always a compound of all sorts of things happening at the same time. And those are supply driven. Sure, we're building a new plant. Plant is extremely slow and expensive to build, and it's been somewhat hamstrung over the last few years by uncertainty across the sector. So we've now got Tiwai having confirmed what they've confirmed. That's great. We can move on and have some certainty around demand in the South Island, and there are investment decisions being made on the back of that. In the meantime, the market's got to keep itself whole, and we're running now at very low rates of water storage. When you don't have water, you need to fill the system with less preferred fuel, and that comes down to the likes of, in particular, gas, which is indigenous. We used to have a gas sector that provided plenty of gas. We don't anymore. And if that's failing, then we need to bring in coal to make up the last mile. Both of those things are happening, but the system itself, the electricity system itself, is very stressed, and just being able to cope with that much fuel and capacity not being in the system at the same time. So, if you look further upstream, there's a lot of attention being brought to gas, and that's absolutely fair to do that. It's not through a lack of investment. We've had 4 or 5 years of very heavy investment in the gas sector. Unfortunately, that investment just hasn't come off, and we're in a gas market which is probably 40% lower than what we had expected a couple of years ago, and that's flowing directly through into electricity because when you're so low on water, you need something else to fill it in. Okay, we've got megawatts available as Huntly and as other thermal plant. Those megawatts are only as good as the fuel you can put through it, and that's where we're short. If we look at that supply-demand balance equation, how much has supply dropped and how much has demand increased? So if we look at separately at gas and electricity, if we look at gas first, a full market for gas in New Zealand is north of 500 terajoules a day. So it's north of 200 petajoules a year. That's what most people have in their head. When there were forecasts put into the sector 2 years ago, so when all this work that I was talking about upstream, there's been about 50 wells drilled in the last few years, a couple of $1 billion has gone into the ground. So the operators have not been sitting on their hands, they've been putting money into the ground. That investment just hasn't come off. That's the nature of the oil and gas business. So instead of being that 200 plus PJ a year market, in fact, 2 years ago it was forecast to be 215 petajoules this year, we're forecasting something in the order of 120. So with that, you've got a 40% reduction or supply that is just not there. And we don't have the ability to be fungible with gas, we don't import it. That's a separate discussion, I suppose, whether or not we should.
We will talk about that.
So when you don't have that fungibility, demand has to shrink to be able to meet supply. That's exactly what's happening. So what the most worrying aspect, I think, at the moment of the entire energy system here is that we're getting very heavy curtailments from major industrial users to adjust the sector to the short supply. So we've seen TY Point coming off by, well, now it's going to be about 180 megawatts of their 580 odd. So they're down about a quarter. The biggest harm is coming through Methanex. So they're the biggest gas users in the market. They're normally, in fact, both of those operations are $1 billion exporters. And Methanex is running at less than 30% now capacity because they just don't have the gas available to them to be able to make up their operations. So this is big export receipts that are not being printed. We already have the worst, or certainly among the worst, balance of payments in the Western world. We've got a problem with GDP, we've got a problem with production. These energy shortages are feeding directly into the ability of the industrial base to keep on doing what they do.
I do want to talk to you specifically about potential import solutions because I know that you are keen to make a little bit of noise on a potential LNG terminal, so I promise we will talk about that. But if we just look at supply still and on production, it's failed not because of lack of trying. But one question I have is storage. I believe only Contact Energy has a storage facility in the New Zealand market. Why have we failed on storage? Why aren't we keeping the stuff on site?
So you're talking specifically about gas again. What's often missed is that we do have storage here in New Zealand. Most of it for the electricity sector comes in the way of hydro, and we're very low on hydro right now. We're looking at the screen this morning. Lake Manapuri is about 3% full at the moment. That's in other words, it's almost empty. Across the hydro system now, our storage is very low. That's where you start moving down the line and picking up on storage that is inferior, frankly, because it's expensive and involves fossil fuels. Everyone's trying to move away from that, but you do what you have to do. So we move into gas storage. You're right, Aharoa is the only gas storage facility in New Zealand, and it's got its own issues around performance. It just hasn't been behaving as what it was expected to be in the last while. And to have storage, you need to have molecules to be able to put into it, and that's what we're also lacking. We don't have gas to be able to put into storage. Put your eggs into a basket during summer when demand is low, and then bring it out during winter. That's just not a cycling ability that we have. Okay, so gas is compromised. Then you move into what storage is left, and we're talking the coal stockpile at Huntley, and that's, whether you like it or not, that's the last mile. And we have seen a resumption of imports coming into the country in just the last month or so, and I'd say that's going to carry on for some time because that's what the system needs to make up for the deficit in fuel, which is further up the chain.
Bottom line, it's cheaper and easier to stockpile coal than it is gas, yeah?
Well, you can't stockpile. If you look at the coal stockpile, it provides very deep storage, and you can see it, touch it, it's there, it's above ground, there's pretty much no risk associated with it. It is a relatively cheap option at the moment compared to other alternatives. If you look at electricity prices at the moment, it's actually relatively economic to use that fuel. But it's the last fuel you want to use for all the obvious reasons, but it's what the system needs. Everybody wants to store more preferential fuels. Everyone wants more hydro. Okay, we're not there. Every year is, people talk about mean hydro a lot. It's just a concept. Every year is different to mean hydro. Last year and the year before, we had a huge amount of water in the system. We've got very little water in the system, and that's what's going to happen with climate change. You're going to get volatility all over the place. So we've got a lot less water this year, and there's been this, here we are type realisation this year. And because we have so much less, zero cost fuel in storage, okay, you've got to go further down the line and keep paying. But even then, you're capacity constrained by how much fuel you can put through the system when essentially you're reliant on the inventory of energy from other countries to be able to keep the system whole. Indigenous gas is a big problem, and that's kind of the middle ranking fuel storage that we have always, or fuel and storage, they're separate concepts. That's where we've always sort of looked to as a sector in the past. That's now compromised. Okay, we've got to go back to coal.
I'm interested in demand response because this is something that we've seen a lot of in recent months. We know that Tiwai has been told to reduce some of its demand on the system, and even households have been asked to not use the heaters.
Not charge their phones. You know, it's
Oh, how will we live, John? But seriously, I mean, this is a pretty big problem. What should we expect to see in both household and industrial demand response?
So, demand response is you often hear the concept demand response, and you often hear it talked of pretty positively because, oh, isn't it good? We're able to help soften the blow on the rest of the sector. You know, the bottom line, we take a pretty dim view on demand response because the reasons I said before, what it requires is that our largest industrial users have to back off production. So that's not ideal. That's far from ideal. Okay, it helps keep the system whole, but in the meantime, you're foregoing export receipts, GDP, jobs, all of that sort of thing, and increasing uncertainty for those users downstream, so many of which actually are just fundamentally struggling with the viability of staying alive at the moment. We've got the highest electricity prices in the world and the highest gas prices in the world. It's really tough for an export business to be able to navigate, let alone when you're getting supply taken away from you. It's almost the worst possible scenario for them at the moment. In terms of users elsewhere in the system, residential consumers, they're always the last mile to have to deal with. It's actually certainly in gas terms, it's a relatively small part of the equation. About 7 PJ a year of demand in a market of 150 or in the old days 200. So those users I think will always be held firm, and supply will never be an issue for them. But you're now getting into the space of, okay, demand response has hit the very big end of town. What happens from here? There is increasing word in the market around users that are smaller, that are facing their own problems in getting, firstly access to gas, let alone at a price that works for them. So that the risk is, as we move forward, that the demand response that we've seen in the market sort of socialises more and becomes more embedded, which is a real worry.
So why don't we import the stuff? We import oil. Why don't we import gas? It seems crazy to me.
Well, that's a conversation that's starting to move up a bit.
But how is that conversation only happening now? Why have we never considered importing it and having import terminals earlier? It
has been considered. 20 years ago, it was specifically considered when we went through our last, I've always tried to avoid the word crisis, but 20 odd years ago, we had a very different, but in some ways similar situation where gas supply fell off very quickly, and there was a project back at that time that was led by Contact and Genesis to look at an LNG import facility down in Taranaki.
Interesting. And they didn't go with it, obviously.
Didn't go with it for a bunch of reasons. It was a very expensive concept. It was permanent, so it would be, it would be here forever, onshore. And in the end, that facility wasn't required because we saw new gas come into the system from particularly Pauakura and Kupe not long after that. We're now in a different place, and frankly the technology that's involved now is entirely different to what was talked of 20 years ago. It's now floating, modular, costs are very controllable, and it's very mature technology. 20 years ago that just wasn't the case. So nowadays when we talk about gas import, we're talking about, in very simplest terms, a vessel that would sit somewhere on a port that connects into the gas distribution network. So whether we're talking the likes of Marsden Point, Port Taranaki, even Port of Tauranga, these are options. And in much the same way that we get cargoes of coal that come into the country, cargoes of gas would come in, offload into this vessel, and this vessel would essentially take this gas from its frozen state, warm it up and put it into the system. So it adds capacity, it adds gas into the system, but probably more importantly, it adds dynamic storage. So you're able to bleed or pump gas into the system from as little as close to 0 terajoules a day through to 500 a day if you really want to, which is the entire New Zealand gas market. So it could cover the entire market if it needed to, which it will never need to, but it's nice to know that it could.
Effectively, it's like a floating storage terminal on a port.
Yeah, that's right. There's some infrastructure on board that handles the gas. So the gas is cryogenic, it's frozen, it's minus 180 degrees centigrade. It's heavily condensed. That's the whole point of it. And each cargo holds about 4 petajoules of gas. And these cargoes ply the world all the time. The LNG is now essentially very similar to crude oil. There's a deep spot market for LNG. You can get it when you need it. It's actually about in today's numbers, about half the price of indigenous spot gas. So if you go and buy a molecule of gas from the spot market today, you'll generally pay about twice the price of what you could get it into the country and into the system for if you were to import it. So there's quite a bit that's attractive about it, given the extent of distress we're now in. And there's frankly nothing unusual about us importing energy. We do it every time you drive home. It's imported refined oil that's sitting inside your petrol tank. To an extent, that's also a little the case with your EV as well, electricity. You know, it is coal. It's 750 megawatts of coal at the moment at Huntly that's keeping the system alive. So there's nothing unusual about importing energy. You just want to import the best energy that you can that works the best for your system.
On a cost-benefit analysis for the energy companies that, and especially for the industrial users that need the gas right now, it seems like, you know, a pretty easy, simple, obvious solution. So who pays for it?
That's an open conversation. So we're just, at the moment, just launching to a next stage of work. We did a big piece on it last year, just a concept type paper. And we're now moving.
Timely.
Yeah, well, we were asked to do it for a reason. And this has all come together a lot quicker than what we were expecting.
Bottom line, we need a solution. Is there desire out there in the energy industry to invest? You mentioned that they've spent billions of dollars over the past few years into the existing oil and gas field and they've come up dry. Are they going to give up and just exit now?
That's a very open question. You know, I literally do not know where those decisions are at. We have a very shallow investor pool now left over after the events of 2018. The exploration ban was somewhat catastrophic for the sector. It saw a widespread exit of investors from the upstream space, and like I say, we've got 3, possibly 4 large investors left, and most of the heavy lifting when it comes to the investment decisions that take place around those 3 or 4 investors are taken offshore. So the biggest player in that space is OMV, Austrian company, and you know, frankly, you know, New Zealand has lost its attraction over the last few years because of the direction of political travel in the last 2 terms of government. So, you know, to take away, New Zealand is now a country that is risk on, whereas previously that just wasn't the case. So, you know, when you're a portfolio operator, New Zealand is one piece of your portfolio, and you know, a lot of your friends have already left. It becomes very difficult to justify going again. Another challenge Kyle can get as well, okay, they've spent a couple of $1 billion over the last 5 years. Well, all that sort of, doesn't that all just prove that the exploration ban was, you know, didn't have much of an effect? Right?
I was going to say exactly that, to play devil's advocate, even if there wasn't that political decision made at that time, they all came up dry anyway, so net doesn't really matter. There's
a couple of schools of thought to that. So the main one is, look, all those decisions, well, most of them would have been taken before the ban was introduced. So such are the lead times involved with making this stuff happen, that you can be looking at 4 or 5 years to be able to go from an investment decision, remembering that OMV bought Shell's assets literally only a few days before the ban was announced. So they would have bought those assets with a plan over the coming years to breathe life into the likes of Maui and Pohokura and to bring more production into them. So that investment did happen. The thing we're most worried about now is not, it's what happens next. You know, that capital cycle is now done. So we've seen 50 wells go into the ground, and we are literally, we think, at a bookend of that capital cycle now. The latest one was a Coupe well, which also came up essentially dry, or at least non-commercial. What happens from here is deeply uncertain because the investment that's required to stabilise, let alone to increase gas supply, is anything but firm or confirmed. And as I say, those decisions will be taken by entities that, you know, the visibility on the basis on which those decisions will be made is very low, and it requires investors from overseas to be able to put capital into the country, and it's not certain that will happen. It'll take quite a, you know, the new government has said that they're going to do a lot to reverse what has been done. I'd kind of refer to that as being necessary but not sufficient to be able to encourage these investors to go again. But it's absolutely got to happen. But yeah, the lack of success over the last few years is a real hammer blow to the sector, because most of those 50 wells were what you'd regard as pretty low risk wells, and they just haven't come off.
There's a lot of complex interest in this industry, I found, at least through my research. For example, Genesis owns a 46% stake in the Coupe production field that you've just spoken about there. Do we need someone independent? Should these companies like Genesis contact, spin off an independent arm that then pays for and finds a solution for this?
Oh, do you mean completely recast the sector? I'm not sure I'll go there. right now. But what does need to happen, I think, is that we're at the stage now where what we have is not working. I think we need to think a little laterally around what happens next. And perhaps LNG is part of that thinking, because it's the sort of thing you can turn around very quickly. Literally a 9 to 12 month turnaround for infrastructure of this type. It's the type of infrastructure that the Europeans put in place when Ukraine did what it did, when Russia bowled into Ukraine and Russian gas fell over. These sorts of facilities turned up very quickly up in Europe and on a very timely basis, and there's a strong argument to suggest that the presence of those facilities went a long way towards insulating Europe from the worst of what could have happened out of the curtailments of Russian gas. So I think you need to, whether you recast the sector and talk about governance arrangements or thermal co has been mentioned in the past, and there are strong arguments for that and strong arguments against as well. But those are discussions I think need to happen because the status quo is, I think, proving right now, given the prices that are being suffered by the sector, the status quo is not working.
Well, I look forward to seeing what you come up with, and let's keep talking because I have no doubt that this issue is not going away anytime soon. I very much look forward to a solution. Thanks so much for your time, John. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Madison.
Thanks for watching Markets with Madison. If you enjoyed this interview, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. I do all of the research for these episodes myself, so your support means a lot. I always love to hear your feedback and ideas, so please drop any thoughts in the comments below. Now go put your money to work.